Imagine you are looking at a country that regularly tops the global happiness index.
Right, like pristine beaches, incredible culture.
Exactly. And if you look at their gross domestic product, their GDP, you'd see this really solid long-term potential for growth over the last half century.
A nice, steady upward curve.
Yeah, a curve that makes you think, well, their national bank accounts must be overflowing, right?
hmm
You'd think everyone there has total financial security.
You really would. I mean, that's the standard assumption.
But today, we're going to flip to the next page of the ledger, because if you look at their true wealth accumulation, there is a metric called the adjusted net savings rate.
And that curve is, it's terrifying, honestly.
It violently fluctuates. And around the year 2000, it actually crashed to negative 6.9%.
Negative 6.9, it's a massive wealth drain.
Welcome to the deep dive. I'm so glad you could join us today, because our mission is to explore this fascinating economic mystery. We're calling it the island paradox of Vanuatu.
It's a complete disruption of how we normally think about economic growth.
Right. And to do this, we are looking at a really comprehensive, multidimensional perspective report spanning from 1960 all the way to 2023.
Plus, we've got decades of raw economic, demographic, and social data from the World Bank.
Right, so we are really looking under the hood of this Pacific island nation. We want to unpack how a quote-unquote happy country can simultaneously be trapped in a negative savings spiral.
And you know, what this actually means for the future of small, climate-vulnerable economies everywhere.
Exactly. Because the data sources we have today don't just give us the superficial macroeconomic story, they let us see the actual mechanics of what's breaking down.
Yeah, the GDP growth is just the facade. The data shows us the foundation.
So let's just jump right into that first core issue, the illusion of growth versus the reality of wealth. If we only look at traditional GDP, Vanuatu actually looks pretty good.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you calculate it in constant 2015 US dollars, their GDP grew from about 336 million back in 1970 to around 652 million in 2023.
That's practically doubling.
It is. It's a nice, steady, upward line. But context is everything here.
Right, because $652 million for a whole country.
It's tiny. I mean, there are mid-sized tech companies that make more than that in a single quarter.
Wow. Yeah, that really puts it in perspective.
So when your entire national economy is that small, you have zero shock absorbers. You are incredibly vulnerable to external shocks.
Which brings us to 2020.
Exactly. In 2020, Vanuatu experienced a massive 5.41% contraction in their GDP.
5.41%.
For a large country, that's a bad recession. For a tiny island economy, that is a system-wide cardiac arrest.
And this fragility is perfectly captured by that metric I mentioned in the intro, the adjusted net savings, or ANS.
Right. ANS is a percentage of gross national income, or GNI.
For our listeners who might just follow standard GDP reports, ANS is so crucial. Think of your own household budget.
This is a great analogy.
Your salary, which is like your GDP, might be going up every single year. You get a raise, you feel richer.
Right. Cash is flowing in.
But what if your house is sinking into a sinkhole? What if the roof is rotting away?
You'd have to pay to fix all of that.
Exactly. Your actual net worth, your true wealth accumulation, is dropping because you are taking constant damage. That is your adjusted net savings.
What's fascinating here is that standard GDP completely misses this invisible drain on wealth.
It just tracks the income, not the rotting roof.
Exactly. And the visual data in our report is so striking. You have this rising GDP arrow on one side, completely at odds with this violently fluctuating ANS curve that dips way below zero.
It's actively leaking wealth.
It is. The calculation for ANS starts with traditional savings, but then it forces you to do some really harsh subtractions.
Like environmental damage.
Right. You subtract the depletion of natural resources, like forest depletion. Then you subtract the economic damage from carbon dioxide and particulate matter emissions.
Okay, wait, let me push back on this for a second. Because if you're listening to this, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, Vanuatu is this tropical island relying on agriculture and tourism. They are barely industrialized.
Right. They don't have massive coal plants.
Exactly. So how is environmental pollution and CO2 damage eating up all their national wealth?
That is the million-dollar question, and it really exposes a deep unfairness in the global economy.
How so?
Well, first, let's look at carbon dioxide damage. They aren't the ones emitting it. But as a low-lying island nation, They are bearing a disproportionate brunt of global climate impacts.
Ah, so they pay the price for other countries'
Yeah,
emission.
exactly. Extreme weather, stronger cyclones, rising sea levels. A single supercyclone doesn't just wipe out a year's crops.
It takes out roads, bridges, ports.
Right. It physically destroys years of accumulated capital. That instantly zeroes out your net savings.
That makes total sense. But what about the particulate matter, the PM 2.5 emissions? Where does that come from, if not factories?
This is something people often miss. In places without reliable, clean energy grids, people rely on solid biomass for basic survival.
Like burning wood or charcoal to cook.
Yes, cooking over open fires or primitive stoves indoors. It generates localized, incredibly dense PM 2.5 pollution.
Oh, wow. So it's an indoor air quality crisis.
Exactly. And it causes severe respiratory illnesses, which drains the healthcare system and completely exhausts the workforce prematurely.
So the pollution is basically eroding human health, which erodes economic potential.
Exactly. Add forest depletion on top of that, where they cut down trees just for short-term export cash, and you can see why the wealth is vanishing.
So they are literally burning their future assets to survive today. Is there anything pulling their savings rate back up?
Just one major thing, education expenditure.
Education.
Yeah. The ANS formula actually adds education spending back into the savings rate because it's considered an investment in human capital. And Vanuatu spends about 4 to 7% of their GNI on education.
Which is pretty solid.
It is. It's the only upward correction keeping the savings rate from completely flatlining.
Okay, so if the macro wealth is leaking this badly, we really need to look at the people who are supposedly generating that wealth. Who actually makes up the economy in Vanuatu?
This leads us right into the second section of the data, which is all about demographics.
And this is where the data gets wild. Because typically, you hear economists rave about a young population.
Yeah, the famous demographic dividend.
Exactly. Everyone says a massive youth population is the ultimate economic weapon. But our sources explicitly label Vanuatu's demographic situation as a quote-unquote youth burden.
Yeah, the data is very stark here.
Why is that? I mean, the youth dependency ratio, which compares children aged 0 to 14 against the working age population, is consistently sitting above 80%.
Above 80%. Just think about that number.
While the elderly dependency ratio is tiny, just 5 to 7%. So it's a pyramid with a huge base and a tiny top.
Right.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Why is this young population considered a burden instead of a dividend?
Well, a demographic dividend doesn't just happen by magic. To turn kids into an economic engine, you need two things.
Which are?
Capital to invest in their education and health, and a growing industrial center to employ them when they grow up.
And Vanuatu doesn't really have either.
Exactly. So right now, that 80% ratio means that almost every single working adult is financially carrying a child.
Wow. 1 to 1 almost?
Basically. So imagine you're trying to save for the future, right? But half of your paycheck immediately goes to basic survival for your dependents.
Diapers, food, school fees.
Right. There is nothing left to save. And that macro negative savings rate we talked about earlier, it starts making total sense at the kitchen table level.
If the households can't save, the national banks have no domestic capital to lend out for big infrastructure projects.
Exactly. The government's tax revenue is completely consumed by just trying to build enough elementary schools and pediatric clinics. They are running on a treadmill just to stay in place.
Man, that is a tight squeeze. So we have this really stressed working-age population carrying a massive youth demographic.
Yeah.
What exactly are these adults doing to earn a living?
This brings us to the labor market, and it's a very precarious picture.
Yeah, looking at the data, the workforce is heavily skewed. About 55% of the entire workforce is in agriculture.
Which is the traditional bedrock of the economy.
Right. But it's highly unstable. The agricultural growth rates fluctuate wildly. I mean, the data shows a plunge of negative 11.1% in past years.
Negative 11.1 is catastrophic for an agrarian society.
And per capita agricultural output is barely growing. It's like they've hit a productivity wall.
They have, because of the nature of the employment.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Over 70% of total employment is classified as quote-unquote self-employed.
Yes, and we need to clarify what that means.
Right, because if I hear that 70% of a country is self-employed, my first thought is, wow, that is a nation of entrepreneurs, like everyone's running a startup or a small business.
I wish that were the case. But in this specific macroeconomic context, self-employed means subsistence farming and informal street vending.
Oh, so it's just basic survival.
Exactly. It's having a tiny plot of land, growing enough yams or bananas to feed your family, and maybe selling the tiny bit of surplus by the side of the road for cash.
And the report specifically calls out the vulnerability of female workers here, right?
Yes, over 80% of female workers are in what's called vulnerable employment.
Meaning informal roles.
Informal roles with zero social security, no minimum wage, no paid sick leave, no safety net whatsoever. If a storm hits or someone gets sick, their cash flow completely evaporates overnight.
That is terrifying. Okay, so agriculture is the first very shaky pillar. What about manufacturing? Can they pivot to factory work?
Well, looking at the data, manufacturing is almost non-existent.
Non-existent.
It makes up a tiny, tiny fraction of their GDP,
Right.
and its growth is completely erratic. Some years it actually shrinks, hitting negative 2.1%.
So they basically don't make anything domestically.
Practically nothing industrial. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the classic structural vulnerability of an island economy.
Because if you don't make anything, you have to import everything.
Exactly. Every car, every refrigerator, lots of processed food, construction materials, it all has to come in on a cargo ship.
And you have to pay for those imports with foreign currency.
Right, which creates a massive, permanent structural trade deficit.
So if agriculture is just subsistence and manufacturing is a ghost town, how do they actually get the foreign currency to buy all these imported goods?
That leads us to the third pillar, the real growth engine and their main source of foreign exchange.
Tourism.
Services and tourism.
Right. People flying in from Australia or New Zealand to stay in resorts.
Exactly. But it's an incredibly fragile lifeline.
The data really highlights that fragility. In 2020, service exports didn't just dip. They suffered a catastrophic 60% cliff edge drop
60% of your main economic engine just vanishing in a single year.
because of the global pandemic. The planes stopped flying, and the economy just froze.
And here is the really insidious part about relying only on tourism without a manufacturing base.
Okay, what's that?
When a tourist comes to Vanuatu and spends $100 at a nice resort, that money doesn't circulate in the local economy for very long,
Why not?
because the resort has to use that $100 to import New Zealand beef, French wine, and foreign air conditioning units just to maintain their luxury standards.
Oh, wow. So the money lands on the island and immediately bounces right back out.
Exactly. It's called a high leakage rate. So even when tourism is booming, it's not building a deep reservoir of domestic wealth.
So they're trapped. Subsistence farming is vulnerable to weather, and tourism is vulnerable to global panic.
It's a severe structural trap.
To evolve past this, to build new industries, they clearly need human capital. Which brings us back to that massive youth population we talked about. Are they getting the tools they need to break this cycle?
Well, this is where we look at education and healthcare. And the data here is a really wild mix of incredible triumphs and deep systemic failures.
Let's start with the triumphs, because the education data is genuinely amazing.
It really is.
The adult literacy rate skyrocketed. Back in 1999, it was around 52.9%. Recently, it hit about 87%.
That is a generational leap.
And the youth female literacy rate hit a high point of 96.8%. That is practically universal literacy for young women.
And from a development economics standpoint, educating young women is arguably the highest return investment a country can make.
It changes everything, right?
Everything. It tends to lower the birth rate over time, which will eventually ease that 80% youth dependency burden we talked about. It improves household health, and it readies a modern workforce.
So that 4 to 7% of GNI they spend on education is doing real work.
It is. But there's a catch in the data.
Of course there is.
The metric called persistence to grade 5 basically are the kids staying in school, and that number fluctuates significantly.
Because getting them in the door is one thing, but keeping them there is another.
Right. If a family is struggling with that kitchen table economy we discussed, keeping a 10-year-old in school has an opportunity cost.
Because that kid could be working the farm or selling at the market.
Exactly. Poverty constantly pulls them out of the classroom.
And even if they do graduate, there is a much darker cap on their human capital.
The healthcare infrastructure.
Yeah, the medical resource data is deeply alarming. Vanuatu has less than 0.2 physicians per 1,000 people.
Often hovering closer to 0.1. Let's translate that so people can really feel it.
Please do.
0.2 per thousand means that for every 5,000 citizens, there is exactly one doctor.
One doctor for 5,000 people.
Across an archipelago of 83 islands.
That is just staggering. I mean, the nurses and midwives fare slightly better, right? The data says 1.2 to 1.5 per 1,000.
Which is better, yes. But a midwife or a nurse, as skilled as they are, cannot replace a surgeon or a specialist when there is a complex medical emergency.
And the human cost is right there in the data. This severe lack of medical infrastructure correlates directly with relatively high maternal and under 5 mortality rates for that region.
Exactly. This raises an important question. Human capital isn't just about knowing how to read.
Right.
It's about being healthy enough to work and live a full life.
And it creates a terrible dilemma for the brightest minds. Like, let's say you're one of those brilliant students who achieves that 96.8% literacy. You get a scholarship, you become a doctor or an engineer.
Right.
Are you going to stay in a country where your own family can't get basic emergency medical care?
Probably not. You're going to emigrate to Australia or New Zealand.
Brain drain.
Exactly. The country invests its limited capital into educating you, and then a developed country reaps the economic benefits of your labor.
Wow. So to fix this, to build the hospitals and hire the doctors, they need massive capital and a government capable of executing that vision. Where is Vanuatu getting its money?
This brings us to the survival logic of the state: governance and foreign aid. Let's look at the worldwide governance indicators, the WGI.
Okay, looking at the WGI, Vanuatu actually ranks relatively well on political stability and voice and accountability, so it's not a war-torn country.
No, it's quite stable politically. Indigenous rights have a voice.
But, and this is a massive but, it scores very low on regulatory quality. At times, it falls below the 25th percentile globally, and its government effectiveness is also poor.
Right.
Can you explain how regulatory quality actually impacts the money coming in?
Sure. Poor regulatory quality doesn't mean the government is doing nothing. It usually means the administrative processes are incredibly slow, inefficient, or legally ambiguous.
Lots of red tape.
Exactly. Say a foreign company wants to build a state-of-the-art coconut processing plant. Good for jobs, good for exports.
Sounds like exactly what they need to fix that manufacturing gap.
Right. But when they get there, they realize 80% of the land is held under traditional customary ownership.
Which is good for indigenous rights, which aligns with their high voice and accountability scores.
Exactly. But because the regulatory framework for leasing that land for commercial use is completely convoluted, that company might spend 5 years just negotiating with tribal leaders with no legal certainty.
Oh, I see.
So what does the foreign investor do? They walk away. They take their foreign direct investment, their FDI, to a country in Southeast Asia where the rules are clear.
So private business efficiency suffers, and the foreign investment dries up.
Right. Which means the country cannot build its own infrastructure using private commercial money.
Which brings us to a really shocking statistic in our sources.
Yeah.
Because they can't attract private investment, they rely on net official development assistance, or ODA, basically foreign aid.
Yes.
The data says that in some years, ODA exceeds 100% of their gross capital formation.
Wait, does that mean foreign aid is literally paying for the country's entire physical growth in those years?
Yes, that is exactly what it meant.
That is wild. Every new road, every upgraded clinic, essentially every piece of new physical capital is being funded by an international lifeline, not domestic savings.
Because their domestic savings, as we saw on page 1, are negative.
Exactly. This is the survival logic of a heavily aided state.
And our sources lay out the data strictly by the numbers. It shows countries like Australia and Japan providing substantial aid. And I want to be clear to our listeners, we aren't here to debate the geopolitics or the motives behind foreign aid.
No, we're just looking at the math.
Right, simply looking at the mathematical reality.
Yeah.
Vanuatu's internal investment heavily relies on external wallets.
It's a structural dependency.
And that dependency is worsened by the environment. Total natural resources rents are pretty low as a percentage of GDP. It's mostly forest rents, zero minerals or coal.
Right, they aren't extracting oil to pay their bills.
But they face severe exposure to PM 2.5 pollution and climate change. Extreme temperatures and floods affect roughly 10.1% of their population.
1 in 10 people.
1 in 10. Every time a cyclone hits, it destroys the infrastructure that the foreign aid just built.
Exactly. So they have to ask for more foreign aid just to rebuild what was lost. It's an endless loop.
It is an endless loop. So pulling all these threads together, our sources outline a definitive island paradox for Vanuatu.
It's a perfect storm of structural limits.
Let me summarize the 4 pillars of this paradox based on the data. Number 1, high youth dependency completely chokes off household wealth accumulation.
Right.
Number 2, a lack of manufacturing enforces a reliance on expensive imports. Number 3, a single-pillar reliance on tourism leaves the country defenseless against global pandemics and climate disasters.
Yeah, that 60% drop in 2020 really proved that.
And number 4, wealth destruction, meaning environmental damage and resource depletion, outweighs actual net savings.
That's the negative 6.9% we started with.
Exactly. So, based on this report, what are the future recommendations? How do they escape this?
The report outlines 3 main pathways. First, they have to increase manufacturing value added.
To shrink that trade deficit.
That's right, even if it's just light manufacturing, like processing their agricultural goods locally instead of exporting them raw.
Yeah.
Keep the profit margin on the island.
That makes sense. What's the second?
Second is a massive investment in healthcare infrastructure. They have to solve that physician shortage.
One doctor for 5,000 people just isn't sustainable if you want a healthy, modern workforce.
Exactly. And third, they need to optimize their regulatory quality.
Cut the red tape.
Cut the red tape, streamline land leasing, and create a stable legal environment to attract high-quality foreign direct investment so they aren't just relying on foreign aid forever.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? It means looking beyond a simple happiness index or a top-line GDP number. True happiness and national stability require sustainable wealth growth.
It requires robust institutional frameworks.
Exactly. The data paints a picture of a nation that is politically stable, making incredible, historic strides in education.
That 96.8% female youth literacy is still blowing my mind. It's amazing. But they are structurally trapped by their geography, their demographics, and their lack of industrial regulation.
It's a complex puzzle, but understanding it is a first step to solving it.
Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this incredibly detailed data set today. It really fundamentally changes how you look at a nation's economy.
It was a pleasure. It's so important to look past the GDP facade.
Absolutely. And I want to leave everyone listening with a final idea to mull over. We've seen how traditional GDP growth masks the reality of negative wealth accumulation in Vanuatu due to environmental damage and structural limits.
Right.
But it makes you wonder, is the traditional industrialized economic model even the right blueprint for a remote island nation?
That is a great question.
If building massive factories isn't physically or environmentally feasible, and global tourism is a fragile gamble as we saw in 2020, perhaps these nations don't need to, quote-unquote, catch up to Western industrialization.
Because that game might just be rigged against them from the start. Exactly. Perhaps they are the forced pioneers who will have to invent a completely new post-industrial blueprint for national survival in an era of climate change. A new way to build wealth that doesn't rely on smokestacks or mega resorts.
That is a profound thought.
Think about that next time you look at a country's GDP. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.